Picking up where we left off with this second Kant lecture. A few odds and ends, and then I just wanted to note the video on the history of human rights, the concept of human rights, that will also be linked, that you'll be expected to watch. Sturba, in the beginning of his section on Kant, does say that if you try to summarize the categorical imperative in terms of what if everybody did that, you're on dangerous grounds. There's a sense in which that's not unreasonable, but there's also a sense in which it's very misleading. Kant himself so disliked summarizing the categorical imperative as what if everybody did that, that he actually wrote an essay complaining about it. And here's what's wrong. If you say, what if everybody did that, it sounds like a cause-effect argument. And it would seem to be a perfectly reasonable response to say, well, don't worry, not everybody will. But of course, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the categorical imperative, just as when we're talking about rational reflection in the Credo. We're talking about, are we doing the right thing? If we're doing the right thing, we should be able to say that, the maxim upon which we're acting we should be willing to universalize it. To say that it would be the right thing for anybody to do in these circumstances, whatever qualifications you need to add to define the circumstances. I'm doing the right thing because I'm willing to universalize it. No double standards, no shoot from the hip here. I'm using rational reflection. I'm using reason to arrive at a priori moral truths, however you want to explain that. Okay? Very misleading to say, what if everybody did that? And use that as a summary of the categorical imperative. Now, you might recall that I told a story about back in the 1980s, and I worked in the operations department of a bank in Hartford. Actually, I was in cash management because I knew nothing about banking, but they needed people who could work with computers. They were first automating back then. I told you about the woman who was ranting to the two other women about how wrong homosexuality is. And I told you the little story about, she said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, what I really think is that you want to deny 10% of the human race fundamental human rights and equality under law based upon Bronze Age superstitions. And her two coworkers were highly amused. She just looked at me like, what language are you speaking? Then after she recovered in a moment, to resume that story, after she recovered in a moment, she said, yeah, well, what if everybody did it? I thought to myself, oh my God, she's paraphrasing Kant, and she doesn't even know it. Okay. Now, many people writing in Kant's lifetime did misrepresent him in that way and say, well, basically what he's saying is, ask yourself, what if everybody did it? No, he's asking, whatever principle you're acting on, what if you could ask everybody to adopt that principle? So it's both narrower in one sense, and it's much more far-ranging in other senses. Okay. But she said, what if everybody did that? And rather than try to explain to her about Immanuel Kant, the categorical imperative, I said, well, you're a bank clerk. What if everybody did that? There'd be no food. We'd all starve because nobody would be growing food. We'd all be bank clerks. And what if you got sick? There'd be no doctors, no hospitals, because everybody's a bank clerk. And what if, and I went on in that way, and she just kind of looked at me like, have you lost your mind? The other two, again, the other two coworkers were highly amused, but it also basically just gave me an opportunity to slip away and not have to continue a conversation that I knew in advance was going to be pointless. As they say, choose your battles. But I tell that story simply because it illustrates exactly the point that you can't treat this as if it's cause and effect, because then there would absolutely be a escape hatch of saying, oh, don't worry, not everybody will. Okay, no, that's not what we're asking. We're asking, am I doing the right thing vis-a-vis could I universalize the maxim I'm acting on? So, one more thing I wanted to add that's worth mentioning, worth isolating out, breaking out by itself. This has to do with the role of sentiment in ethics. No one could live, Kant's fourth exception, or fourth example rather. No rational being could desire a life devoid of normal human friendship and affection. Well, that's exactly true of severe sociopathy. I was a social worker for a number of years. I worked with diagnosed sociopathic adolescent males. That's about what it sounds like. As one of my coworkers put it, you can't help, your heart breaks for them, what they go through and what they've gone through. But on the other hand, you can't for one moment forget about the fact that they are currently, however they got to where they currently are, they are currently very dangerous. Okay, essentially, a sociopath doesn't have a conscience. It may be neurological problems. It may be abuses during upbringing. But it's usually a combination of the two. A sociopath doesn't have a conscience, really, or minimally has a conscience, and has no empathy. Could that person want a life devoid of a normal human friendship and affection? Yeah, and oftentimes sociopaths are very smart. Okay, another Batman reference here. If you watch The Dark Knight, the film The Dark Knight, which, as I said before, is philosophically a very interesting film, the character of the Joker is very intelligent. Batman is brilliant, Bruce Wayne is brilliant, but the Joker is always like 2 steps ahead of him. Actually, one of the moral themes throughout that movie is that the Batman, the Joker, and Commissioner Gordon are essentially the same character. Very small changes in the conduct or the sentiments of any one of them, and any one of them could become one of the other too. Okay, so yeah, and the Joker is smart enough to realize this. Batman doesn't catch on to it, but the Joker realizes you're just me with a slight variation. At one point, Bruce Wayne's butler, Alfred, is talking about the olden days when he was a mercenary, and they were after a jewel thief in Burma who typically did pointless, awful destruction in his wake, and then just discarded the jewels like they weren't really what was important to him. He wasn't after revenge, he wasn't after wealth, he wasn't after power, which is exactly what they had said about the Joker. What is it that he wants? And Alfred concluded that some men just want to see everything burned down, and will take themselves along with it gladly. Yeah, there are such people. They just want to see everything burned down, and they are very willing to burn down with it for the sake of being able to burn it all down. Okay. During the 1990s, there were several studies, one of which I remember the title of the book was CEOs and Sociopaths. And essentially, the person was warning, we are creating a system of rewards and punishments in our society where people are actually rewarded for behaving like sociopaths, where we actually empower sociopathy. If we do that, guess what the outcome is going to be for everyone? Well, we'll talk about that more when we get to the Singer book, but one needs to keep that in mind. If we empower people for acting like sociopaths, for being sociopaths, we will end up with a society that resembles a war of everybody against everybody else without principle. So, and it's not that the Joker's not rational. He's very smart. He's very rational. But that's not enough. As Bertrand Russell put it, the good life is the life guided by reason and inspired by love. Well, exactly what do you love? That's going to make a difference. Or do you love it all? You'll note in this short film on human rights that Kant isn't mentioned at all. Okay, that doesn't mean he's not important. It means that he's important at a level that is culturally enriched, below the level of political events. If you were going to talk about the most important 19th century composers, you might not include Franz Liszt on your list of the greatest composers of the 19th century, but everyone you did include on your list would probably point to Franz Liszt and say, there's my inspiration, there's the person who is sort of my model for what I did. Okay, so Kant is kind of the same way, right? The people that we might mention as the champions of human rights may never mention Kant, but if you were to trace their ideas back, you'd find that Kant is a wellspring for those ideas, especially for the articulation of those ideas in a way that would eventually become politically applicable. Okay, Kant was a celebrity in his day. It's hard for us to realize today, but he was a celebrity intellectual, much the same way that, say, Albert Einstein was a celebrity intellectual in the early 20th century. Everybody knew what he looked like. Everybody knew his name. Everybody knew he was really important. He had really important ideas, and most people couldn't, if their lives depend on it, explain to you what his ideas were. And the popular press was full of all kinds of misrepresentations, oversimplifications of his thought, just as in Kant's day, the popular press, popular literature was filled with oversimplification of Kant's thought. Okay. I remember in the 6th grade I was reading a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, and there was a story in which Poe referred to Kant's Categorical Imperative. And at the time, I didn't know what it was, but I remember kind of making a mental note. Sometime I should find out what this is. Well, much later, I did find out what it is, and also realized that Poe, who was a very popular author in his day, sort of the Stephen King of his day, Poe had totally misrepresented Kant's ideas, but in a way that was probably not at all uncommon for the popular press of his day. Alrighty? So, okay, the film doesn't mention Kant, but if you look at the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, most of it could be lifted right out of the writings of Kant. Okay, as a matter of fact, the UN Charter was consciously adapted from an essay by Immanuel Kant called On Perpetual Peace. Okay, so Kant's influence is very strong in that regard. Whenever anybody says this or that country is violating the human rights of some minority, the Chinese violating the rights of the Tibetans or the Falun Gong, or Myanmar Buddhists violating the rights of the Muslim minority, or etc. Okay? When international human rights groups point to those and say, you have no right to do that, generally the governments will make a pretty predictable reply, which is, this is an internal matter, it's none of your business. Well, politically, yeah, it's an internal matter. And politically, a foreign group may not have that much clout. It may, but it may not have that much clout. However, what typically a human rights group will say in response is, these are human beings, and human beings have certain fundamental rights a priori rights, if you know. You are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No government has the right to arbitrarily deprive its citizens of those fundamental rights. You may have the power to do so. Your laws may be sufficiently oppressive that you have the power to do so legally, but that does not mean that you have a moral right. Well, moral rights, of course, aren't necessarily persuasive. I remember during George W. Bush's first term, um, he did a number of things that were it was highly questionable that he was this was even before the Iraqi war, that he was violating international law. I remember a reporter at one point saying to him, do you think you're violating, what do you say to those critics who say that you are violating international law? And he just grinned and said, "Oh, international law," mockingly. "I guess I better get a lawyer," and walked away. Like, who cares? What are they going to do? Later, when American corporations were, including Shell Oil, I believe, were sued in the World Court over human rights violations in Africa, they were basically hiring mercenaries to chase people off of their land so that the oil companies could drill for oil there, including just shooting people, wiping out villages so the oil companies could move in unhindered and wouldn't have to essentially buy it from the people living there and wouldn't have to worry about whether the people living there wanted to sell. Well, of course, the human rights organizations took that matter to the World Court, and the official response of the Bush administration is the World Court doesn't have jurisdiction over American corporations. Hello? Run that by me again? Are we signatories to international law? Yeah, I believe so. So what we're saying is that we'll pick and choose which of those laws we want to pay attention to, and if it isn't what we wanted to do anyway, we'll just ignore it. Well, you look at the kind of chaos that can happen. And indeed, much of the world views, let's say, America no longer taking the moral high ground on these issues as somewhat disastrous, both for America's stature in the world and for the conduct of affairs in the world. You can't say everybody's got to play by the rules, but guess what? We're not going to. Because then it's no longer a matter of playing by the rules. It's a matter of simply we're going to pursue our advantage and you're going to pursue your advantage. And there are no rules about what we can do regarding how we're going to pursue our advantage. That, my friends, is sociopathy on a global scale. So, the alternative is that we try to maintain some sort of moral order in our own society and in our relations with other nations so that we can flourish together instead of falling into that perpetual war of all against all. At the beginning of this, of the human rights video, they're doing, poking microphones into people's faces around them and saying, apparently asking them to define what human rights means. And one woman says, well, you can ask 20 different people and get 20 different answers. There's something true about that, and there's something also, I think, really seriously misleading. One, what's true about it is that people may not have thought it through. People may not have a clue what human rights amounts to. And in fact, I think most American citizens don't even know what's guaranteed under the Bill of Rights. They either ignore it or misquote it, or not understanding the degree to which they are protected by it, they wish they could get away with it, do away with it so that they could get away with, various things that it prohibits. But the thing that is misleading about it, I mean, it's important to point that out, that, people may be severely uninformed. The thing that's misleading is that it makes it sound like it's all up for grabs. Okay, well, clearly when we're working out rules, what rules we need, how we need to constrain ourselves, what we need to prohibit and what we need to promote so that we can flourish together, so that we can have positive relationships together, that's not something that you can decide on your own. or that any one nation can decide on its own, because it's about relationships. If I say, I am beside the bird, you know what I mean. Here I'm talking about a relationship. But if I just say, I'm beside, you'd say, what do you mean? No, I'm just beside. Beside what? No, I'm not beside anything. I'm just beside. I have a right to be beside if I want to be beside. It's up to me. Beside what? It's a relationship. Oh, yeah, says you. Well, you'd think that that person was either trolling you or was a little messed up, let's say. What are you talking about? It's a relationship. Okay? Morals, ethics, it's about relationships. We arrive at rules based on what relationships we need in order for us to constructively live together. The whole notion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is there are certain basic human rights that have to be recognized if people are going to live together well, not only within their own countries, but if they're going to be international relations that are optimal. Okay, now, of course, if a nation becomes a member of the United Nations, and they have to sign on to the rules of the United Nations, one of which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you are contractually bound. Without enforcement, and without the possibility of enforcement, you may as well not even have those rules. Okay. Now, people criticize the UN for not, doing whatever to enforce its own rules and so forth, but the United Nations was never meant to be a military organization, right? An international coalition authorized by the UN may only intervene in a nation's affairs if, one, that nation invites it to, or some legitimate body within that nation invites it to, or two, the Security Council unanimously agrees that it's an emergency and they must take action. Very difficult for those things to happen. Sometimes that does happen. Oftentimes it doesn't, and that's frustrating to many people. You say the UN is ineffectual because they didn't get involved in this or that situation. In fact, the UN does, on a day-to-day basis, do a whole lot of good with a whole lot of programs in a whole lot of countries, but to be able to forcefully intervene, that's a whole different matter, and it's probably a good thing that they can't do it casually. As the story goes, I believe it was Eugene Debs, an American politician of the 20th century, who said, "Never hand the government a mallet to hit your enemy. Understand that the next person they'll hit with it will be you." Okay, that's something to keep in mind. So, I hope what I'm pressing upon you is that Kant's ideas about intrinsic rights, intrinsic worth of human beings, does have very, very much flesh and blood, real world consequences, and those consequences are recognized and by many people throughout the world, and also are acted upon, even if those people do not understand the contribution that Kant made to that way of thinking. When your kindergarten teacher says, "Stop it, what if everybody did that?" Blah, blah, blah. You can't jump out the window like that. What if everybody did that? Probably the teacher doesn't have any idea about Kant's contribution to that way of thinking. A German professor talks about being approached by a police officer in the New York subways, and told that he couldn't smoke in the subway, the professor pointed out, "I am not smoking, my pipe is not lit, and I am exiting the subway." And the subway cop got a little incensed, as though his authority was being challenged, and he said, "Look, if I let you do it, I'd have to let everybody do it." And the Professor Morgenstern, rolled his eyes and said, "Who do you think you are, Kant?" The officer immediately arrested him, took him down to the precinct. The professor explained at the precinct about Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative and was released with apologies. Of course, the cop who arrested him had never heard of Kant and just thought he was being sworn at in German or something. Oh well. So, you throw a rock, as the Chinese parable puts it, you throw a rock into the river and the ripples go out, and you don't necessarily know where those ripples end up. So, okay, please watch the video on human rights, on the history of human rights and the concept of human rights. Historically, it leaves some things out. Historically, it oversimplifies a few things. It is very much worth watching. If this were, we were going to look, spending a great deal of time on the history of the notion of human rights, we would probably need a corrective to some of the things it says. But for a basic introduction, it's just fine. I hope you enjoy it. You have a right to enjoy it.